media.
The last gift. The old man in room 237 had been in the nursing home longer than anyone could remember. Walter Crane, if that was even his real name, had no visitors, no records beyond the basic paperwork that placed him there over a decade ago. His body was little more than brittle bones wrapped in tissue-thin skin, his voice a dry rasp that barely escaped his throat. He never spoke unless he had something to say, and when he did, his words stuck to the mind like damp cobwebs. His advice was unsettling, eerie in its accuracy. He once warned a nurse to check the brakes on her car, and when she did, she found a line had been nearly severed. He told an orderly that his father's watch, one he had lost as a child, was hidden inside an old air vent in his childhood home. The man went back that weekend, pried open the vent, and found the watch exactly where Walter said it would be. No one could explain how he knew these things, and no one wanted to ask. There was an air around him, something beyond frailty, beyond age, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you lingered in his room too long. That week, the nursing home was filled with a rare excitement. The National Big Spin Lottery had climbed to a record-breaking $950 million, a number so absurd it felt unreal. The residents joked about it, their laughter edged with the awareness of how little time they had left. "I'd never spend it all before I go," one of them quipped, "but I'd sure like to try." Even the staff was caught up in the frenzy, exchanging daydreams about what they'd do with that kind of money. It was the only thing breaking up the monotony of the slow, creeping days. Nurse Julia had never planned on bringing her 4-year-old daughter, Ellie, to work. But when her babysitter canceled last minute, she had no choice. It would only be for an hour or two, and Ellie was well behaved, a ray of sunshine in their quiet little world. The moment they walked through the halls, the atmosphere changed. Residents lit up as if they had been given a second life. Ellie's laughter echoed against the sterile walls, and for a brief moment, the nursing home felt less like a waiting room for death and more like a place where something still lived. Julia didn't think twice before pushing open the door to room 237. She had tended to Mr. Crane for years, and he had never seemed particularly dangerous, just unsettling. He had never shown much emotion, never so much as cracked a smile, until today. The moment Ellie stepped inside, Mr. Crane moved. He sat bolt upright, something he hadn't done in years. His brittle fingers clutched the thin blanket covering his lap, and his sunken eyes, usually clouded and vacant, were bright, alive. His entire face changed. And then, the most chilling thing of all, he smiled. A wide, genuine smile. It was the first time Julia had ever seen him look happy. "Hello, little one," he rasped, his voice stronger than it had any right to be. Ellie beamed. "Hi, mister." Julia stiffened. Something about the way he was looking at Ellie made her uneasy. Not in a way that set off alarms, but in a way that made her feel like he knew her daughter, like he had met her before. But that was impossible. Then he spoke again. "You love strawberries," he whispered, "but only the little ones. The big ones taste funny to you, don't they?" Julia froze. It was such a small, insignificant detail, but it was true. Ellie had said the exact same thing just a few days ago, pushing aside the bigger strawberries on her plate and wrinkling her nose. Julia hadn't told anyone about it. "How did you know that?" she asked. Mr. Crane didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered in the air as if asking permission. Ellie, innocent and unafraid, took his hand. His skin was paper thin, cold, yet he gripped her tiny fingers with surprising strength. His gaze softened, and for a moment he looked at Ellie as if she were someone he had known long ago, someone he had loved. Then, without looking away from Ellie, he whispered, "Write these down." Julia hesitated. "What?" His voice became more urgent. "Write these down, now." Against every instinct screaming at her to take Ellie and leave, Julia grabbed a notepad from the bedside table. And then Mr. Crane spoke a series of numbers, 6 numbers, the exact format of the lottery. His breath was shallow now, his grip on Ellie's hand tightening. "These are the numbers," he rasped. "Play them." Julia's heart pounded. "Why are you telling me this?" Mr. Crane finally looked at her. The warmth was gone. His smile faded. His expression was unreadable, something deeper than sadness, heavier than regret. "Because you were kind to me," he murmured, "and because it's almost time." His eyes flicked back to Ellie, and then, in a voice that barely reached above a whisper, he said, "For both of us." A chill crawled up Julia's spine. The air in the room felt heavier, like something unseen had settled over them. She wanted to ask what he meant, but Ellie suddenly giggled and squeezed his hand. "You're funny, Mr. Crane." His smile returned, but this time it was bittersweet. "Take care of her," he whispered. That night, Julia couldn't stop thinking about it. She told herself it was ridiculous, an old man's ramblings. But something in her gut wouldn't let her throw the numbers away. So, against her better judgment, she bought a ticket. When the numbers were announced the next night, her heart stopped. Every single number was an exact match. She had won $950 million. The entire nursing home was in shock. Some laughed, calling it the best parting gift a resident had ever given. Others whispered about Mr. Crane, about how he always knew things. But Julia? She couldn't shake the fear creeping up her spine, because Mr. Crane had said, "It's almost time for both of us." That night, unable to sleep, she checked on Ellie. The little girl was curled up peacefully, breathing softly, safe. But as Julia turned to leave, something caught her eye. A shadow, a figure, reflected in the mirror on the closet door. An impossibly thin man, smiling, watching. Julia spun around, but the room was empty. The next morning, news spread through the nursing home. Mr. Crane had died in his sleep, just hours after the numbers were drawn. Julia tried to tell herself it was a coincidence, that none of it meant anything, but deep down she knew. He had given her something, and now something was coming, waiting, and it had been looking at her daughter. Aldo's Fine Cigars. The shop had always been there. No one knew for how long, and no one could remember when it first appeared. It was just there, wedged between buildings that changed hands every few years, a relic untouched by time. It wasn't in any directory, had no phone number, no website, no trace of its existence outside of those who had stepped through its doors. And once they did, they never really left. The neon sign above the shop hummed weakly, buzzing faintly in the night. Aldo's Fine Cigars. The lettering was cracked, barely visible through the smoke-stained glass. The scent that drifted from inside was unlike any cigar Jeremy had ever smelled before, deep, rich, ancient. It pulled him forward before he even realized he was walking. The bell above the door let out a sound that wasn't quite metal, wasn't quite glass. It was a wet chime, something thick and unnatural, curling through the air like a whispered warning. The shop was dim, lined with shelves of dark wooden boxes, each one unmarked, stacked high in perfect, unnatural symmetry. At the center of it all sat the man behind the counter, old, wrinkled, eyes too bright, too knowing. "You like cigars?" The voice was dry, a sound like dead leaves rustling in a room with no wind. Jeremy hesitated. Not really. The man didn't blink, didn't move. "You will." A single cigar slid across the counter toward him. It was dark, almost black, wrapped in a leaf that looked wet, glistening faintly under the dim light. It had no branding, no label, just a sickly sweet aroma that curled inside his sinuses, dulling his thoughts for a brief moment. "First one's free." He took it. That night he lit it on his balcony, staring out over the city. The first puff was smoother than anything he had ever tasted, and then the visions came. Not like dreams, not like thoughts, but memories of things that hadn't happened yet. He knew that his phone was about to ring, that it would be his father calling to say that something felt off, that he had a bad feeling. He knew that if he turned his head, the woman across the street would drop her wine glass in exactly 6 seconds. And it happened, exactly as he had seen it. The power was intoxicating. The next morning he tested it, took another drag. He saw the exact moment his barista would spill a latte. Saw the streetlight flicker before it happened. Saw the winning stocks hours before the market opened. It wasn't just luck, it was absolute knowledge. And he wanted more. He went back to the shop. The old man was waiting. "You want more." This time there was a price. Jeremy paid it without hesitation. The visions grew stronger. What had started as glimpses of minutes ahead stretched into hours, then days. He saw things before they happened, dodged accidents, made the right bets, manipulated conversations with eerie precision. But then, the side effects began. At first, it was just small things: a headache, a nosebleed, a deep, gnawing hunger that never quite went away. But soon the misfortune started. A woman walking past him on the street burst into flames. No explanation, no cause. A man in his building tripped down the stairs and snapped his neck at an impossible angle. He hadn't done anything to them, hadn't touched them, hadn't even spoken to them, but the cigars had. He should have stopped, but he couldn't, and neither could the others. Words spread in whispers, passed between desperate lips. Those who smoked knew, and those who knew would never stop. They came in droves, crawling out from the city's underbelly. Men in suits, junkies, housewives, the rich, the poor. All of them drawn to Aldo's, all of them chasing the same thing, just one more cigar. At first, they paid in money, but money wasn't enough. One by one, they traded. A man came in with a hand wrapped in bloodied cloth. When he unwrapped it, there was nothing beneath. He took a cigar with his remaining fingers, lit it with trembling hands. A woman limped in on one leg, her other pant leg sewn shut. She smoked deeply, her face contorting in a mixture of agony and euphoria. A man in the corner rocked back and forth, cradling an empty socket where his left eye had once been. And still, they smoked. For every glimpse into the future, something was taken. A hand for a day's worth of visions, a foot for a week, an eye for a year. And once they started, they could never stop. Jeremy saw it all. The addicts clawing at the door, screaming when the shop was closed. The fights that broke out over the last cigar in stock. The men who crawled inside, missing fingers, missing limbs, their bodies slowly unraveling with every drag they took. And still, he smoked. Because he had seen what happened if he didn't. One night, after an especially deep puff, he saw it. His own death. Not a vague premonition, not a shadowy figure, but exactly how it would happen. The date, the time, the smell of gasoline in the air, the flickering street lamp above him, the sound of his own bones snapping as something moved in the darkness behind him. He tried to change it, tried everything, avoided the alley, moved apartments, changed routines. But no matter what he did, the future always corrected itself. And with every puff, he felt it slipping away. Not just his time, not just his body, but his soul. One night he woke to the smell of smoke, not from the cigars, but from his lungs. His breath curled into thick black tendrils, moving against the air like something alive. His reflection in the mirror grinned back at him, but his mouth wasn't moving. And in that moment, he knew that he had already lost, knew that he was nothing more than another customer in a long, endless line. And behind him, in the darkness of the mirror's reflection, the old man watched and smiled, because the shop would always be there, waiting. And outside, the line of desperate smokers stretched down the street, some with missing hands, some with missing legs, some missing their own names, their own minds, their own identities, but all of them hopelessly, helplessly addicted. And inside, Aldo reached beneath the counter and placed a single cigar in front of the next customer. First one's free. Media. The pickpocket. Elliot had always been good with his hands. Ever since he was a kid, he had a natural talent for slipping things away unnoticed. Coins from his father's dresser, candy from the convenience store, a stranger's wallet on the subway. It started as a game, a test of skill, a way to see what he could get away with. But by the time he was 26, it had become his livelihood. He lived in a city where crowds never stopped moving, where people clutched their bags tightly but never tightly enough. He had rules: never steal from the desperate, never get greedy, never leave a trail. His hands were quick, his movements precise, and he never made mistakes, until the night he did. It had been a slow evening. He was working the usual spots: crowded train platforms, dimly lit bars, busy sidewalks packed with tourists. He had already taken a few wallets, some loose cash, a watch that looked expensive but probably wasn't. Nothing special, nothing unusual. Then he saw her. She was standing alone on the street corner, her back to him, staring down at her phone. There was something off about her, though Elliot couldn't quite put his finger on what. She wasn't like the usual marks. She wasn't distracted by conversation or burdened with shopping bags. She was completely still, shoulders slightly hunched, as if waiting for something she didn't really want to arrive. The leather purse at her side was slightly open, an easy lift. He moved closer, careful, invisible, his fingers brushing against the bag's zipper. The moment he made contact, a deep, suffocating chill ran through him. His breath hitched, his skin prickled, and for the first time in years he hesitated. Then, without warning, the woman turned. Her face was wrong. It wasn't disfigured, wasn't grotesque, but something about it made his stomach twist. Her eyes were too wide, too knowing, her pupils dark and deep, as if they led somewhere he didn't want to go. Her lips were slightly parted, as if she had just been whispering something she wasn't meant to say. And then she smiled. Not a polite, surprised smile, not an amused grin, something else. A slow, creeping, almost hungry smile that stretched just a little too far. Elliot's instincts screamed at him to run. But before he could move, her hand shot out, fingers curling around his wrist like iron. Her grip was ice cold, unnaturally strong, his entire body locked up. "Not yours," she said softly. Her voice was smooth, deliberate, as if she had practiced those two words 1,000 times. Elliot yanked his hand back, stumbling away, heart hammering against his ribs. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching him with that impossible smile. He turned and walked away as fast as he could without running. He should have left it alone, should have gone home, forgotten about it, chalked it up to a bad mark and bad luck. But something gnawed at him, a deep, slithering discomfort that refused to leave. When he finally made it back to his apartment, he emptied his pockets, fingers trembling slightly as he counted his take. And then, at the bottom of the pile, he found it, the wallet. Elliot froze. He didn't remember taking it. He was sure, absolutely sure, that he had pulled his hand away before he could grab anything. But it was there, small and black, sitting among the stolen cash like it had always belonged. He picked it up with numb fingers. It was smooth, worn leather, unremarkable except for the strange, swirling pattern etched into its surface. No ID, no credit cards, no cash, just one thing inside, a photograph. He pulled it out carefully, already dreading what he would see. It was a picture of a man. The quality was grainy, faded, but the details were clear enough. The man was standing on a street corner just like the woman had been. But something was wrong with his face. His eyes were wide, hollow, his mouth slightly open as if whispering something just beyond hearing. His expression was frozen in a look of terror, his body stiff, unnatural. Elliot's stomach turned. He flipped the photo over. On the back, a single word was scrawled in smeared black ink. "Mine." A heavy weight settled in Elliot's chest. He shoved the wallet back onto the table and stood, pacing the room, trying to shake the growing nausea twisting inside him. It was a prank. It had to be. A setup, a joke, some kind of sick game. He needed to get rid of it. He grabbed the wallet and threw it into the trash. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. That night, Elliot dreamed of the woman. She stood at the foot of his bed, still as a statue, her hands at her sides, her lips moving silently. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't hear what she was saying, but he knew, deep in his gut, deep in the marrow of his bones, she was saying his name. When he woke, his apartment was silent. The air was thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing against his skin. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face, trying to shake the remnants of the nightmare. Then he glanced at his bedside table. The wallet was there. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He had thrown it away. He was sure of it. His hands shook as he picked it up, flipped it open, pulled out the photograph. His heart stopped. The man in the picture was gone. The street corner was empty. The back of the photo had changed too. The ink was fresher, sharper, as if it had just been written. 3 words, scrawled in the same uneven handwriting. "You took it." A sharp, creeping horror clawed its way up Elliot's spine. He dropped the wallet like it had burned him, backing away, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He needed to get out. He needed to leave. But as he turned toward the door, something in his periphery caught his eye. A shadow, not in the corner, not near the window, right behind him. He turned too slowly. The woman was standing in the reflection of the mirror, staring at him with that impossible stretching smile. Her lips moved. This time he heard it. "Mine!" The lights flickered, and then everything went black.